You're listening to the Study Podcast with Dr. Paul Wegner on Deuteronomy. I'm your host, Tyler Sanders. I'm here with Dr. Paul Wegner, and he's going to give us the Hebrew word of the day.
Before I do that, I'm going to actually talk about the name for Deuteronomy.
Okay.
The second law is basically what the word means. Comes from the Greek again.
Yeah.
This book is a summary of the laws that are expected the people to follow once they arrive at the promised land. So let's see if I can historically catch us up.
Yeah.
So we've just been through Numbers, and Numbers basically got us all through the wilderness wanderings, got us all the way up to the plains of Moab.
Yeah.
And now they're ready to go in. Deuteronomy is kind of like, I think it's in the form of a suzerain vassal treaty, but it's like a covenant form that they would know right as they get ready to go into the land.
I see.
So it reminds them again of their covenant.
Yeah.
And then some of the laws are going to be a little different, but I think the logic is they're in a totally different place now.
Yeah.
Like some of the laws of you weren't supposed to let a slave go when they're in the wilderness wanderings, especially a female slave because they didn't have any way to take care of themselves.
Yeah.
Now a female slave can be released from bondage. Things like the Passover lamb was supposed to be cooked or roasted in the wilderness wanderings in Leviticus. When you get to here, now it can be boiled because when they get into the promised land, they better have water that's.
Sure. Yeah,
imagine if you're in the desert and you have bad water, it could kill a whole bunch of people.
Yeah.
When you get into the promised land, you should have
Consistent,
plenty
good
of
water
water.
source. Yeah.
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 So things like that. And I think the logic is they're in a totally different. Now, remember, it's 40 years later. They've been wandering all that
true.
time.
Yeah.
They're now in a totally different situation, ready to go in. So
Essentially a new generation, really.
Yeah, and so it makes some sense to have a few modifications to the laws. So I think it all makes sense. So now they're ready to go in, and there's a covenant reminding them what they're supposed to follow. And remember, one of the biggest things when they go in the land is they're going to have a problem with false idols and stuff like that.
Right.
So he makes that really clear too, and reminds them again, if you start following these other gods, you're going to be kicked out of the land.
Yeah.
So he does it again and reminds them.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. That's a picture of a suzerain vassal treaty.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So let you know the kind of structure we got. All right. Okay. Here's our word. Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. The Lord is our God. The Lord is one. And it's that word ahad that means one. And the question is, does that mean that it's a unity, one of parts, or is it one entity, one thing?
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure at this point it means one thing and not a collection of parts.
Yeah.
Though there's some places you may get that kind of logic out of it. Like in Genesis 1:5, you've got one day. Well, okay.
Oh, like a single day out of a week, essentially? Yeah.
So
I see what you're saying.
So it's possible, but it seems like more the whole purpose for Deuteronomy is to remind them this isn't a God. This isn't a polytheism like all the other gods. This is one God.
Yeah.
So I think the context actually really suggests that. 1:9 talks about one place. That one's pretty hard to get around, I think.
Yeah.
Remember in Genesis, you've got the Genesis 2, where a husband and wife are to become one flesh. Now, you could have that those two people are making up one, but the real emphasis in that passage is they're one unit.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really telling. So people that use this verse to talk about the Trinity, I just think are totally wrong. I don't think that's at all what it's getting at. Here's some more. 11:6, it talks about, remember that's where the genealogy is divided and they are one people. One day, one people, one night, one stock. So I think some have used it to argue that it's one made up of unity, and I can see where sometimes that may work.
Yeah.
But I think the whole purpose of the passage is to tell us God is one, not like the other nations that have these multiple gods.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm at least arguing for here.
Yeah.
So this is probably where the idea of monotheism came from, Deuteronomy here. But I think especially a lot of people talk about henotheism or something like that. You have one God that's above all the others.
Oh, I see.
And I'm going to argue that this is probably still monotheism,
Yeah.
but it's what I call a practical monotheism. There may be other gods, but you better only serve Yahweh.
Right.
It's not until later that you find out that there's what's called an ethical monotheism, where there is only one God. I've got this. By the time you get to Isaiah, he actually makes fun of all these other gods and saying that they're nothing. They're just
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah,
wood or stone or whatever
Yeah.
God, people have made.
Yeah.
So by that time, it becomes what I would say is an ethical monotheism. But I still think it's been monotheism all the way through. It's just that God didn't talk about the others, and that's what the difference is. When God says, "I'm Yahweh, I am your God, I am one," I think he's getting at, you better only care about me. Forget all those other ones.
Yeah.
Just worry about me. And it doesn't really talk about them. When you get to Isaiah, he makes it real, the last part, it makes it real clear. I'm the only God. These other things are just idols and stuff that they're not real gods anyway.
Yeah.
So I think by that time they were able to tolerate that kind of an understanding.
Yeah.
I think in Deuteronomy, if he would have brought that onto him, it's just something they couldn't have handled. They had been brought up in that so much that he had to deal with them for a while before he could actually then say, remember, I talked about me being one God.
Yeah.
Now there's no other ones,
Yeah.
So I think that's what happened. God had to wait until they were ready to handle it before he could give it. And then by New Testament time, they start understanding that God not only is one, but he's made up of three parts.
Yeah.
See,
It's three and one.
Again, under Old Testament context, in the ancient Near East, they would have thought that was polytheism.
Yeah.
So they weren't ready to handle something like that
Yeah.
till like New Testament time. Now they're starting to understand that there's a possibility of still being one God, but having different forms or things. And then they had to figure out, oh, no, just not forms. These are actually persons.
Yeah.
So by 300 in the
As it
Nicene,
develops.
yeah,
Right.
So then you've got the Nicene Creed making it real clear,
Right.
So, but I wanted you to see there's a progression in how people understand it
Yeah.
and how much they can take at each time. I think is what God's doing.
Yeah, sure.
So anyway, all of that to give you some. So I called it practical monotheism in the earlier parts of the Bible, and then an ethical monotheism by the time you get to Isaiah.
Yeah.
Okay. In fact, he then goes, I put here, then he goes on and mocks those that rely
Yeah.
on those gods that are supposedly gods.
Yeah, I think that's a really good distinction.
Yeah. I hope it's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Here's our book. I dated around 1400. Traditionally, it's been connected with Moses. I don't see any really good, strong arguments against that. Purpose is to formalize God's covenant with the nation of Israel before they go into the land. And then Deuteronomy 6:4, I think, is the key verse. Okay? It's got two kind of structures. One is it's got Moses speaking. So there's four basic parts to it. And the last one is Moses' last words. But but within that structure, it seems like it's more like the Hittite treaties. So it has an introduction, which is common in those treaties. Then it has a historical prologue telling about what the relationship between the God and his people throughout history. And that goes basically chapter 1 through 3 is pretty clear. Then there's stipulations, what they're supposed to keep, and those will be the guidelines on how to follow this relationship. Then it's got a reading of a document clause, it's called. They read it so that everybody remembers it and also are supposed to agree with it again.
Yeah.
Then there's witnesses and curses and blessings. Now, they always don't have to be in the same order. And as you can see, Deuteronomy doesn't quite follow that order, but neither did the Hittite treaties. So it's not that they all had exactly the same form, but they had these parts.
Yeah.
One other thing that's, I think, really important is that it has a historical prologue, and those were only in the second millennium covenants. So from in the, let's say, 1900 to 1100. So that time period, they had historical prologues. When you got under 1,000, they no longer did. Oh. So I actually think that's pretty good evidence that
it was an earlier
document. Kenneth Kitchen brought that out in his study of the covenants, and I think it's still a helpful thing, though a lot of people disagree with that. I think it makes sense. All right? All right. So key ideas. The law, God graciously explains his expectations through law. Now remember, that's totally different than the ancient Near East, right? They had to guess what their gods wanted.
Right.
Yeah. The central sanctuary becomes pretty important, even though they didn't tell them where it was yet because they hadn't got into the land.
Yeah.
He does say a place where I'm going to cause my name to dwell.
Yeah.
So he does make it clear there's going to be a central sanctuary at some point.
Yeah.
And even though he doesn't mention where it is yet. And then history as theology. I think that becomes important because what you're learning is as it goes through history, it's actually telling how God's dealing with the people. So you're actually learning about theology as to how he deals with sin and stuff like that throughout the history.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important. Then you've got the retribution principle. If you're obedience, you'll have blessings. If you're disobedience, you have cursing. That's really crucial for a covenant, right?
Yeah.
If you didn't have those kind of things, why would anybody keep a covenant, right?
Yeah, sure.
So, and that's why witnesses are important too. When you brought your gods to witness the covenant, then those gods were responsible for upholding the covenant.
Yeah.
So I can see why every part of those are actually pretty important to what we're doing here.
Right. Right.
All right, here's my comparisons there. And then, again, no historical prologue, the first millennium. All right. And then, okay, so we've got the preamble, just basically explains what's going to happen. Deuteronomy 1:1, these are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel across the Jordan in the wilderness of Arabah, opposite of Suf. Between Paran and Tophel and Laban and Hatzeroth and Jazabab. We don't know where a lot of those are. We do know where Paran and Hazeroth, I think we do know those. So I've put it here. We're somewhere in that place close to Jericho. Jericho is going to be the first place they come across. And right across from Jericho, there actually is a ford area that you can actually walk across. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why Jericho was where it was, is because it was to guard that place across the Jordan.
Cross, right.
Yeah. So anyway, that gives us some clue. They're ready to go in. God reminds them of what's going on. So it says it takes 11 days' journey from Horeb to Kadesh. So from Sinai is another name for Horeb. So it takes 11 days to get up to Kadesh. Okay.
Okay.
Verse 2 says it's 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh. Then verse 3 says in the 40th year on the first day of the 11th month. So we just, it's only supposed to take 11 days. It took them 40 years.
Right.
Yeah. So it's almost like a joke in there.
Yeah.
But unless you're really understanding what they're saying, you're going to miss what's going on.
Yeah.
It makes it sound like there's just a gap. Well, there is, but the gap is really important.
Yeah.
Okay. So thought we should see that.
Yeah.
All right. So we've got, here's another map that's probably helpful. You can see Ezion Geber down here on the Gulf of Araba. So now they're working their way up, and they're going all the way up to, you can see the top of it where there's Shittim. That's basically real close to where the plains of Moab are.
Okay.
All right. It says they refused to go into land at Kadesh Barnea, so it's going through their history.
Right.
They did not trust the Lord. Well, now, so now they got another try again.
Yeah.
It's verse 37 says, God was angry with me also on your account, saying, not even shall you enter there. Do you remember I told you that Moses is going to keep bringing this up, that it's the people's fault instead of his?
Yeah.
There's the first one.
Yeah.
So Deuteronomy has about 3 or 4 of them.
Yeah.
It's really kind of funny. All right. Also in the historical prologue, then you said to me, we have sinned against the Lord. We will indeed go up and fight just as the Lord our God has commanded us. And every one of you girded on his weapons and regarded it as easy, go up to the hill country. And the Lord said to me, say to them, do not go up or fight, for I am not among you. Otherwise you will be defeated before your enemies. So I spoke to you, but you would not listen. Instead, you rebelled against the command of the Lord and acted presumptuously and went up to the hill country. The Ammonites who lived in the hill country came out against you and chased you as bees do and crushed you from Seir to Hormah. So this historical prologue is going to be the faster way to go all the way through that history that you had in Numbers.
Yeah.
This is going to do it in like 3 chapters and explain it in a condensed format.
Yeah.
Then they moved on from Edom. He told them not to take possession of that because that's Edom's possession, so they weren't supposed to harm it. Then told them not to harass Moab because that's Lot's possession. And he says it takes them 38 years from Kadesh to Barnea to the brook of Zerah. Here's a picture where the brook of Zerah is. So it's right at the bottom of the Dead Sea.
Of, Moab.
Okay, so that gives us some real clue too.
Yeah.
All right. It's okay. Then it tells them not to harass the Ammonites, so that'll be the next one up. That's Lot's position. But he said they did fight the Amorites. Remember, we've got Og and the two Sihon and Og that are up there, and they fight them, take their land. So they've got that. We've got the defeat of them. Go and return up to the road to Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, and all his people came to meet us in battle at Adri. So that's going to be the first king destroyed. Then verse 6 has the second one. They utterly destroyed them as they did to Sihon, the king of Heshbon. So now we've got Og and Sihon both destroyed. I tried to find verses that would remind you of those two passages.
Yeah.
Okay? And then at that point, they gave the land to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the Manassites, half tribe of Manasseh, if you remember.
Yeah.
But remember, they have the land, but they still can't go in. So this is a part of the history.
Yeah.
Because they haven't gone into the land yet. So he's just telling them, okay, you got the land, but you got to fight with us.
Yeah.
And so that was what he was reminding them of. All right, Moses pleaded with God. Oh, I wanted to show you this. In chapter 3, verse 23, God finally says, I've had enough. You know, I told you that Moses keeps asking God if he can go in, and he keeps blaming the Israelites.
Right.
So God said no, but Joshua will lead them in. He says that. Now, here's what he says. Let me, I pray, this is Moses talking, let me, I pray, cross over and see the fair land that is beyond the Jordan, that good hill country of Lebanon. But the Lord was angry with me on your account and would not listen to me. And the Lord said to me, enough, speak to me no more on this matter.
Wow.
That's the only time I've ever seen where God actually chastens somebody for continuing to ask it.
Right.
God's finally have enough, and he won't tolerate anymore.
Yeah.
So that actually lets you know a little about God, too. He doesn't tolerate our whining very well.
Right.
I just thought it was funny. That's the only place I've really seen something like that.
Yeah.
Oh.
And it's another example of Moses
Yeah.
saying it's
complaining.
not really my fault. You know.
You're right. Oh, all right. Moses clearly blames Israel. Here's the passages. So I've got all three of them.
Yeah.
The Lord was angry with me on your account, but the Lord was angry with me on your account. And then 4:21. Now the Lord was angry of me on your account. So he keeps blaming them, and he blames them 3 times in the book.
Yeah.
I just think that's funny.
It is.
Oh, all right. Okay. Then now we've got the exhortation to be obedient, a whole chapter telling them what's going to happen if they don't. I'm going to read verse 5 for you. See, I've taught you statutes and judgments, just as the Lord God commanded me, that you should do this in the land which you are entering to possess it. So keep and do them, for that is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the people who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. Do you see? So it makes it real clear the reason that they're supposed to do this is so they'll be an example to these other people, and they'll realize, oh, this is what we should be doing. Look how wise they are.
Yeah.
So that's why I put a little flashlight down here.
Yeah,
this is that
it's an
idea
illumination.
of being that light to the nations.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then right after that, he's got keep the 10 commandments.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the logic makes sense.
Yeah.
And it makes also sense to not follow after idols. That's going to be so clear.
Yeah.
The Lord will punish idolatry by sending you out of the land in chapter 4, verses 25 through 31. Let me just read this because it makes it real clear. When you become a father of children and children's children and have remained long in the land and act corruptly and make an idol in the form of anything and do that which is evil in the sight of the Lord, your God, so do as to provoke him to anger, I will call from heaven and earth to witness against you today that you shall surely perish quickly from the land where you are going over the Jordan to possess it. You shall not live long in it, but you will be utterly destroyed. So he makes that really clear. And now you would think that once God's done this and made it so clear that they would certainly avoid it like the plague, right?
Right.
But I think we got to remember now this is over hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So Deuteronomy, let's say it's when they go in the 1400s. Now they're not going to be kicked out until almost like the 600s, right?
Right.
So this is going to be hundreds of years that they're going to be playing back and forth. Now the first couple of years, at first, let's say even first 300 years till David, 400 years, they're doing pretty well.
Yeah.
But then after that, they get bad kings and stuff like that. They have a split.
Oh, yeah.
So they're going to have times like that. But I can understand more if you put it into perspective of how long it was.
Yeah.
So
And it kind of implies that in the first verse.
Yeah.
Father of children
Yeah.
and children's children. There's kind of a generational
that's right.
digression or something that
Yeah.
happens
And it's
here.
going to take some time.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Moses chooses cities of refuge. Remember, I told you we were going to talk about those.
Oh, yeah,
So
yeah.
here's those 6 cities of refuge. It even explains what they're for. Moses set apart 3 cities from across the Jordan to the east that a manslayer might flee there.
That's right. I remember this.
Yeah, who unintentionally slew his neighbor without having enmity toward him in the time past, and by fleeing to one of these cities he might live. It almost makes it sound like it's an automatic thing. I don't think it was. I think you had to convince the gatekeeper that you are here because somebody got killed and it was unintentional. So I want him to get in. And then apparently I understand they have a case, a law court where they actually decide. And as I understand it, you could bring witnesses and stuff like that so that you could. Now, if you dilly-dallied, now look, notice everyone is probably within 20 miles or 25 miles from one. So you actually so it covered most of the land.
Yeah.
And you just fled to the one that was closest to you, I assume.
Yeah.
So if you didn't go to Shechem, you could go to Ramoth Gilead, but you'd at least be close.
Yeah.
All right. So anyway, the logic is that then if you'd killed somebody accidentally, you'd flee to those. If you dilly-dallied, the manslayer might, like a relative of who you killed, might come after you and kill you. If that happened, it's up to you. It's your own fault. You didn't get there fast enough.
Right.
But I actually see this as a real logical thing why God could say, you know what? I don't want people who are not guilty to be killed. So I want to have a way of making sure they're not punished for something that they did accidentally or something like that. Because remember, even if somebody fell off the roof on your house, if you didn't have a parapet or a thing around it, you could be held responsible.
Right.
So I think he wanted to make sure that there were ways of protecting people that were innocent.
Yeah.
So I actually think this is a real helpful thing.
Yeah.
All right, then we've got Moses' second speech, and this it talks about the law given to the Israelites and how he gave it on the other side of the Jordan. Make sure they understood the covenant and all that. And then he's renewed in chapter 3. It says, "And the Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, all of those who are alive today." So he renews the covenant to the new generation.
Yeah.
So it reminds them that they're still going to be held responsible. Then in chapter 5, or starting at chapter 5, you got those stipulations. Most of Deuteronomy is going to be those stipulations, right? So Decalogue, you shall have no other gods. You shall not make any graven images. You shall not take your God's name in vain. Observe the Sabbath.
Yep.
All of these are describing your relationship with God.
Yeah.
Then the next 4 next 6 are going to be your relationship to others.
Yeah.
You shall honor your father. You shall not murder. So the first 4 are how do you deal with God. Second 6 are how to relate your relationship with others.
Yeah.
So it's pretty helpful. Oh, do you remember in the New Testament where Jesus says, when they ask him what's the greatest commandment, and he says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your." That's summarizing the first
those
4
two
commandments.
categories.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then the second is
Yeah.
it is going to cover the second one.
Yeah.
So it's actually kind of a neat thing there.
Yeah.
All right. It talks about the writing them on the tablets. Moses came to be Israel's spokesman. Verse 26 of chapter 5 says, For those who are there of all flesh who had heard the voice of the living God speaking from the midst of the fire, as we have and lived, go near and hear all the words our God says, then speak to us all that the Lord our God speaks to us, and we will hear it and do it. So they were at that point, they were trying to say, don't have God talk to us because we're scared, but have Moses be a spokesman for him. And so Moses records that to make sure they remember that.
Yeah.
All right. And then talks about them walking in ways that God commanded them.
Yeah.
All right. Now, my best way to kind of explain the Decalogue is to kind of go through these different commandments and show how they're explained. and expanded in the rest of Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
So you've got, you should have no other gods before me. Well, that seems like it's explained in Deuteronomy 6 through 11. You should not make for yourself an idol. Deuteronomy 12 seems to cover that.
Yeah.
So it seems like what's happening is you've got the commandments here, but then the rest of Deuteronomy is explaining them further.
Corresponding passages. Yeah.
Yeah. Chapter 6, you get, Hear, O Israel, your God is one. The Lord is your the Lord is your God. The Lord is one. And then don't follow other gods. Pass on God's laws to your children. Chapter 6, drive out the Canaanites before us because God is our great God. So it's reminding them. So it's basically telling them, first of all, He's their God. Then the second one is the warnings if they don't kick the people out. Chapter 8, pretty similar to the same kind of thing. God brought them into the great land. He is your God. Chapters 9 and 10 pretty much talks about we have this good land. Don't bring idols into it. So more warnings.
Yep.
Then you shall have no other gods. Chapter 11 says, love the Lord your God, keep His commandments. So it's enlightening what it means to have other gods before you. And once again, it's got quite a few warnings to tell them, don't follow other gods.
Yeah.
Okay, then you should not take any idols. I put this picture here of Baal because Baal is going to be their one thorn in the flesh, right? He's going to be the one that's in their own land, and all the people think he's the originator of the gods, of their God in Canaan.
Yeah.
So he's going to be the one that's going to be so hard. And chapter 12 makes it real clear, don't you follow these other gods and don't obey them. Chapter 13, don't take the Lord's God's name in vain. So he's talking about false prophets that could be out there doing that. Anyone who leads others to serve other gods should be stoned. So that's another clear indication he's talking about God's name.
Related,
You are holy, so again, you must eat clean things. That's because you're connected with God. So I do think these are connected there.
Yeah, for sure.
Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. It talks about tithe and then the sabbatical years and the releasing slaves and all that. But that was under that idea of a Sabbath, I think.
Yeah.
Talks about Passover
and
and
celebrations.
Yep. Then we go into the other commandments that are talking about the humans.
That second category relating to people.
And we've got other explanations of those, it seems like. Let's see. So chapter 16, judge honestly. Do not set up false gods. You're right, wondering how's that honoring your father and your mother? Well, if you don't judge honestly, then you're putting an embarrassment to your father and mother. Or if you're setting up false gods, these fathers and mothers have told us about our gods, now we're setting up different ones.
Yeah.
All right? Give the best of the sacrifice, stone the person that worships other gods. So it's judging fairly. These things seem to be connected with the father and mother's gods that they've already told us about.
That was kind of the warning we got earlier, again, of like, your children's children may depart from this,
That's right. All right. More taking care of the Levites. So all these, the Lord will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, and you shall listen to him. So the idea of sticking with that God that the fathers have taught us about.
Yeah.
Okay. You should not murder. So it talks about the cities of refuge.
Oh, yeah.
And that makes sense. Boundary markers, don't move. That was kind of like the big no-no in the ancient Near East. And the reasons were because no one else could. If you stole land from somebody else by moving a boundary marker, who else was going to be able to check on that? And who would know? Right. So that's why they called the gods. And it's connected with their murdering because you're stealing something from somebody that could actually cause them to die. If you took enough land, they couldn't actually make it.
Yeah.
So anyway, some connections there. Rules for covering fair wars. Another thing is don't destroy cities' trees.
Wow.
Now you think that's funny, but remember if they did that, that could mean for generations.
Yeah.
Trees take a long time to grow, and they were there for food and stuff like that. So that's again,
it's like uninhabitable,
and it's like murdering somebody because you don't make it so that they can actually live.
Right.
So you can see how those are connected. How about if somebody dies near a city? Who's held responsible for that? Well, it actually explains that. How do you know who to take care of? And if nobody knows, they put that in God's hands to let him deal with it. So what you expect.
Yeah.
All right. You should not steal. Talking about various laws about giving back your neighbor's ox or something like that. More laws about not stealing and gleaning and vows. All those are connected probably with stealing. You shall not commit adultery. Chapter 24 is that law of divorce. I wanted to talk about this one because this is kind of interesting. I got my little diagram up there, but let me see if I can explain. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency here in her, we're not sure what that indecency is. Obviously, later on, another person's going to marry her. So whatever that indecency is, it's not so bad that somebody else won't marry her. So even the scribes and Pharisees, they had some debates as to what this indecency was. Yeah. Anyway, so he's supposed to write her a certificate of divorce and put it in her hand, and sends her out from his house, and she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. And if the latter husband now turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if that later husband dies who took her to be his wife, then that former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. That's what the translations say.
Yeah.
The question is, what does that mean?
What does that mean?
Yeah. Okay. For this is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gives to you in an inheritance. My understanding. Okay. So does this all make sense? First, you got a man and a wife. He offers her a certificate of divorce. She goes, marries another man. Now he either dies or divorces her.
Yeah.
She can't go back to that first one.
Yeah.
So that's impossible for that to happen because it says it's an abomination before the Lord. But he says the reason is since she has been defiled. Now this is going to sound real difficult, but what I think it means, it's a hithpael in a Hebrew, which means it's usually a causative stem, causing something causative, but also a reflexive idea. So if it's got the causative reflexive idea in it, it could. I think it's to be translated this way, because the first husband, has caused her to consider herself to be unclean. So I think what that means is let's say that this woman has got some indecency, whatever it is, and he publicly divorces her because of this indecency.
Right.
My understanding is that he's causing her to consider herself to be defiled because of that public thing. My understanding is that she probably would not be able to forgive him, so she should never go back to him because it was a publicly humiliation. Yeah. So he has caused her to consider herself to be unclean, I think is a good translation of that.
Wow.
So it makes some sense then.
It does, yeah.
So but I think the translations don't do it justice. Yeah. And I actually got that from John Walton in an article he wrote in about the hithpael form. Yeah. So I think it makes sense.
That's a lot. There's a lot of nuance in that.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah. And that could have been our Hebrew word for the day.
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, okay. There's more laws in general about that, not giving false testimony. Now, I've rearranged these because they seem like it fit better, but these things don't oppress your servant or fathers can't be put to death for sons. That seems connected with don't give false testimony because that's how those kind of things would work out probably.
Yeah.
And then the adultery thing fit that one real well. You should not covet, so you've got the gleaning laws. I mean, the only reason you probably wouldn't let somebody glean is because you're too jealous of your land. So the idea of coveting your own thing and not giving it to others. 25, more laws, do not muzzle an ox while he's threshing. That seems to make sense in the idea of coveting because now you're even from an animal, you're keeping things from eating. And first fruits offering, God has been good to you, but if you're coveting, you're not willing to give those things to God.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, why those fit in that category. Then there's a concluding exhortation. 26 talks about them being careful to do all that God has said. So we just got out of all those stipulations. Now it's going to conclude that by saying, obey these. Don't go back on the things that God's told you to do. Walk in his ways and keep his statutes. For you are God's treasured possession. Now that's because they're in that covenant relationship with him. He's taking care of them because of that covenant. He wants them to realize that connection. So, and he goes on and says they're a consecrated people. So that's now exhorting them to keep up this covenant because if you break it, God's going to punish you.
Yeah.
Then there's a document clause. It talks about setting up large stones and coating them with lime and then recording the law on those. That's actually what's supposed to be done with a covenant. It was supposed to be put in a temple, and every year it was supposed to be brought out and read. My understanding is
interesting.
what
Yeah.
these were for was so that they would keep reminding them what to do.
Yeah.
And then it even on Mount Ebal, and they set up an altar there of uncut stones. I think it was probably to remind them again of this covenant that they had made.
Yeah.
And then it looks like verse 1 and 10 are inclusio. Warren says, "And Moses, the elders of Israel, charged the people, saying, keep all the commandments which I've commanded you today." Then in 10, "You shall therefore obey the Lord your God and do the commandments, the statutes which I commanded you today."
Yeah.
So it sounds like you've got him telling you to do it, and at both ends of it, it's now reminding them to do it again.
Yeah.
So hopefully helpful. Then you've got, remember the blessings and cursings on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal.
Yeah.
So now you got the blessings on Gerizim. So these will be, blessed you'll be in the city, blessed you'll be in the offspring. So he tells them all these things. If you keep the covenant, that'll happen. Then you got all the consequences of disobedience. Cursed you be in the city and the country. Cursed will be your offspring. So again, if you disobey that covenant, these are the things that are going to happen. And one of the covenant or the curses again is going to be that you're going to go into captivity.
Yeah.
So it reminds them again that this
Yeah.
is the consequence.
Yeah.
All right. So it's 41 says this: "You shall have sons and daughters, but they will not be yours, for they will go into captivity." So he makes it real clear.
Yeah.
So now we're into the third speech, which is his final charge. It talks about the covenant at Moab. I want you to see this because this one's actually pretty important. It says in chapter 29, verse 1 says, "These are the words of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to make with the sons of Israel in the land of Moab." So remember, that's where they are.
Yeah.
And it said, these are the words. So he's gone over them and they're in Moab, beside the covenant which he made at them at Mount Horeb. Remember, Mount Horeb's another name for Sinai?
Yeah.
So what's the covenant he made with them at Mount Sinai?
That'd be the 10 Commandments.
Yeah. And actually all the
Yeah.
law, we'd call it the law,
The law.
the Mosaic law.
Yeah.
So it says this one is a separate one from that one. So I think it's letting you know, people call it different things. Sometimes talk the Palestinian covenant or
The
something.
second one is what they would call
Yeah,
it?
I actually think this is Deuteronomy because he said these are the words of the covenant which Moses spoke. So I think what it's saying is, all right, the first covenant was at Mount Sinai.
yeah.
I don't think this is a second covenant, but it's certainly a second reminder. We've got new people.
Yeah.
And remember, it makes it real clear he's making it with them today.
Yep.
So I think what this is doing is it's reminding them, here's a separate covenant. It's not different than the one we had before, but it's outlined in such a way of a suzerain vassal treaty to help you know these are the guidelines. These are what you're supposed to do. If you break it, these are the consequences. So it's in a format that they know already existed. And I think this is really helpful to remind them right as they're going into the land, here's kind of a summary of the things that they're supposed to do once they get into the land.
Right.
So I think that's what's going on. And it says they have seen all of God's work, but still don't get it. They say, yet to this day, the Lord has not given you a heart to know or eyes to see or ears to hear. So even in Deuteronomy 29, he actually lets them know, you guys have been real hard-hearted.
Yeah.
You better make sure you keep this covenant. And it's a reminder that if you don't, there's consequences.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an interesting thing, and he makes it real clear. God's covenant is with them and with the generation after him. Verse 14 says that. Yet not with you alone am I making this covenant, and not in this oath, but both with those who stand here with us today in the presence of the Lord our God, and those who are not with us here today. I assume that means, and the ones who are coming, and the ones probably that went before, because remember, it's still the same covenant, I think.
Yeah, right.
It's just now a reiteration of it or reminding them of it. So I think it's the same one.
Yeah.
And it talks about obeying the blessings, disobeying the, get cursings. So it's interesting. They, again, reminds them of the retribution principle, but connected with the covenant. Now that you've made this covenant and you said you were going to obey it, God's going to hold you to that.
Yeah.
And then this it even says this in verse 29, the secret things belong to God, and the things revealed belong to us and our sons forever, that we may observe the words of this law. I think what he's reminding them of is, all right, there's things God keeps silent and he doesn't tell us about, but there's things he's revealed. The things he's revealed are in this covenant here. These are the things you're supposed to keep track of and the things you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's what it's getting at. It's reminding them once again, you aren't going to know everything about God because he hasn't revealed all those things.
Right.
But there's things you are supposed to know, and he's revealed those. Keep those.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good reminder for these people. It talks about God's promised blessings. He goes through and explains those again. Verse 2 says in chapter 30, chapter 30, and you return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and soul, according to all that I command you today, you and your sons, then the Lord your God will restore you from captivity and have compassion on you and will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. So that is a really encouragement, it seems like to me, right? So he's already told them the curses and the blessings.
Yeah.
So if you wander away from me, I'm going to send you off. The blessings are that if you obey, you'll get all these. But then he says, but there's even hope if you disobey.
Yeah.
That I will, if you repent in captivity,
Yeah,
I will bring
there's a
you back.
release.
Yeah. So God will remember you and deliver you. So that's the encouragement to them. He even talks about circumcising your heart. You thought that was a New Testament idea, didn't you?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, he says, moreover, the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord God with all your heart and with all your soul so that you may live. So it's even given us understanding. What's it mean to circumcise your heart? It means to obey and to listen to these and have a sensitivity for them.
To love God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's real clear. Then God will bless you. They will have a choice to choose life. This one's really helpful, I think. See, I've set before you today life and prosperity and death and adversity. And then basically he says, choose wisely.
Yeah.
They know now. So I
Yeah.
think that's helpful. Then the last 4 chapters are pretty much miscellaneous. It talks about Moses living 120 years. It said that I'm 120 years old today. I am no longer able to come and go. And the Lord has said to me, you shall not cross over in the Jordan. But he didn't say, and it's your fault again.
Yeah. But he's accepted it.
Yeah. And then it talks about Joshua being victorious over the Canaanites. He tells them to be strong and courageous. Remember, when you get into Joshua, that phrase strong and courageous
comes up a lot.
Yeah, a lot. And it's reminded here. God will not forsake him. He will go before you. So Moses is encouraging the people that God will be with them.
Yeah. Which makes sense because
Yeah.
Moses won't be there. He's been kind of the spokesman for God this whole.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Read the law and remember, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place where he will choose. Notice he still hasn't told them where it is, but wherever it is, you shall read this law in front of all Israel in their hearing. So it's to remind. Remember I told you about covenants were to be read. So Moses is reminding them that's what's supposed to happen. He even says that Israel will fall away. Verse 16 said, the Lord said to Moses, behold, you are about to lie down with your fathers, and this people will arise and play the harlot with the strange gods of the land in the midst of which they are growing, and will forsake me and break my covenant which I have made with them. So Moses can even tell them that this is going to happen.
Yeah.
Joshua then is commissioned, and that commission is in public so that they all know that he's the next one that God's going to use.
Yeah.
And then the book of the law is placed by the ark as a witness. Verse 26 says, take this book of the law and place it in beside the ark of the covenant for the Lord your God, that you may remain there, that it may remain there as a witness against you. So after they wrote that apparently in a covenant, now it's placed by the ark so that it was always going to be there as a witness.
Yeah.
So I think that's helpful too. All right. There's chapter 32 is often called the Song of Moses. He talks about God being their rock and his work is perfect and all that. They've acted corruptly. They'll follow after false gods. They will be punished, but God will have compassion. Verse 43 is pretty important. Rejoice, O nations, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants and will render vengeance on his adversaries and will atone for his land and his people. So encouragement once again that God's going to protect them and even punishes their enemies. God then tells Moses to go up on Mount Nebo and he can see the land. This is a picture from Mount Nebo, and it's not, you can't see very well, but as you go over there, Mount Nebo is high enough that you can actually see into the promised land.
Right.
So he's able to look over there, and this little map here actually shows them where like Mount
Sort of
Hermon
different
is and
locations.
stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of neat
Yeah.
if you're there. And then 33 is actually he has blessings for each of the children.
Yeah.
So Reuben, may he increase. Judah, be a help against his enemies. They shall teach, Levi shall teach his God's laws.
that makes
See,
sense, yeah.
so each one of those looks like it fits really well the children. So
Yeah.
all these are a blessing to each of them. Dan is going to be a lion leaping from Bashan. Naphtali is blessed of the Lord. So it has a blessing pretty much for each of them. Then it says, the Lord, there is none like this eternal God who rides among the heavens and protects his people. So just to remind them of what Moses thought God was like and that he would protect his people. And then Israel, blessed is Israel who is saved by the Lord. Your enemies will cringe. So again, what's going to happen for Israel's enemies and that they'll be blessed.
Yeah.
Chapter 34 is the last part of it. It actually says Moses sees the land, then he dies on Mount Nebo, but then it says and no one knows the place to this day. So in my mind, it even suggests that this passage was written a little time after Moses.
Right.
Most people have argued, well, let me show you the next one too. Israel wept for him for 30 days, and then Joshua takes over. Verse 10 says, since then, no one has arisen like Moses. Here's the verse 10 is the clear, and that since that time, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Now, if Moses died yesterday, and then they say something like this,
Of course not.
yeah, right. Who would expect that quick?
Yeah.
So it must be sometime afterwards.
Yeah.
Even the Jewish scribes argued that chapter 34 was written by Joshua sometime later.
Yeah.
And it would make some sense.
Yeah.
That would be the one who would probably most likely be the one that carries on his work and would do that. So again, there is a logic that this is written later, but I don't think you have to argue the whole book of Deuteronomy was. I think chapter 34 could have been written later, and it seems like to me it must be written later.
Yeah.
But I don't know that means the whole book was written later.
Sure, yeah.
So anyway, that's kind of the end of the book. Let's see. Questions. Why did the author use the structure of suzerain vassal treaty for Deuteronomy?
They're entering a new land. It's kind of a
Okay.
new circumstance, basically.
Okay.
Right?
And why as a treaty format, do you think?
Rather than just like the
Yeah.
original kind of covenant format.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think we've seen that like they were familiar with these types of things
There you
from
go.
other, A&E kind of cultures.
Excellent. I think that's it. It was known throughout the day. Why not use it if it's something that made total sense to them already? Why not structure your book in that format so that they understood it?
Yeah.
So I think that's it. Why is the Decalogue so important?
Well, goodness. Well, it's kind of a summary of how the people are supposed to react towards God or act towards God.
So I think that's perfect, right? So you've got this Decalogue, and it's now explained in more detail in these other laws, but it makes it real clear. Even Jesus summarizes it in these two different commandments.
Yeah.
So he could actually summarize it. Now here's the stipulation spelled out in Deuteronomy.
How it actually functions.
Yeah. All right. And remember, it's not different things. It's all these things just kind of flow out and are explained more thoroughly.
Right. Right.
Okay, what's the purpose for the book of Deuteronomy?
This may be an overstatement. I don't know if we'd say reestablish.
Okay.
But I think it's that idea of it kind of it's a look back at that covenant and how this is going to work out.
Okay.
Now you're in the promised land,
And
or you're about to enter the promised
I'm
land.
not so sure I have a problem with the reestablishing, because remember, that whole generation dies out. So now a new generation has to take these consequences and say, okay, I want to have these laws. I want to have this covenant made with me also.
Yeah.
So I can actually see why having it.
Reestablishment could be
Could be an actually good term for that.
Okay.
Yeah. Why would some scholars believe that Deuteronomy is one of the most theological books of the Old Testament?
Well, you mentioned at the beginning, you kind of get this idea of theology through history.
Good.
That you're seeing how God acts, basically. And that's telling you a lot about who he is.
Right? Remember our covenant, or what our cursings and our blessings?
Yeah.
So obedience brings blessings,
Yeah.
disobedience brings cursings. I mean, that summarizes a good share of the Old Testament, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So I think those are all interconnected, and I think that's why. Okay, conclusion. God chooses to make Israel his people to be a light to the rest of the nations. This book is kind of like a summary of that, I think. And you kind of got a good example of that.
Yeah.
God gives us stipulations of how the nation should respond to be a good example of their God. The tabernacle was the representation of God for the Israelites. So we've got this, again, now they've got this tabernacle. So they've got this God almost dwelling with them. Remember, when they get in ready to go into the land, the tabernacle is walked through, and the minute they touch the water, it splits apart.
Right.
So it's a really good example of here's God going with us to actually protect us.
Yeah.
And so I think it's helpful. Sacrifices help them learn that sin had consequences. That's
Right.
kind of the same thing we learned
Like
before.
in Leviticus, yeah.
But now Deuteronomy is again explaining that. The Israelites did break his covenant, but remember,
Yeah.
several times he reminds them that even if you get kicked out of the land,
Yeah.
he's going to come back.
There's a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's all kind of a summary of it.
Yeah, that's really good.
That's Deuteronomy.
Yeah, that's the Torah.
Yeah.
Really. We made it
Yeah.
through all five
That's right.
books. It's very exciting.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. I guess we go on.
Yeah, and now it's time for Joshua, right?
Yeah. All right.
Okay, that's good. Thank you so much.
Yep. Bye-bye.